Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to hopefully the final part of this trio of reactions to Jordan Peterson and Chris Lunsford. First time around, we were mostly talking about music. Second time around, I went off the rails. I was doing an economic rant. This time around, who knows what's going to take place? Let's get into it.
It's been interesting. I think obviously a lot of people understand what it is I'm trying to say or what my message is within the song, but it has been interesting seeing both sides also attack me, misinterpreting that I'm identifying with the other. You know, I've had, for example, I've had, even just recently, I've had some conservatives give me grief for making the comment that we're stronger or something to the, this was in the middle of a concert and it was, I think I said strength through diversity, which really resonates on exactly what that point is, that we need to have people that think differently use those strengths to work together in a way that makes us all stronger. But I think...
Isn't that amazing? He used the terminology strength through diversity, and he got attacked by the right. Why did he get attacked by the right? Because the term diversity has been so equated with diversity of these physical immutable characteristics that diversity no longer means diversity of thought, which is probably what he was going for all along. But that is a clear instance of how a single word has been completely hijacked connotatively.
People are so used to hearing that as a sort of a left-wing rhetoric that they immediately identified it as that. And then on the flip side, I've had the left very much attacking me as being sort of this right-wing, far right-wing, whatever, you know, and you've experienced this yourself, but...
That one, I'm guessing, is more due to his physical appearance. I think there's a very quick mental heuristic that people use when it comes to country music and equating it with Republicans, conservatives, people down south, people who voted for Trump. I'm not justifying this heuristic, but I'm explaining what's going on. In addition, some of the topics that he was singing about, taxes, inflation, male suicide. These are topics that tend to get equated with right-wing interests. Not to say that those on the left don't care about that kind of stuff. At the end of the day, who is pro-male suicide? Nobody is pro-male suicide. And yet these days, when you talk about issues that are relevant to men, there's this weird left-wing assumption that you're discounting issues that are affecting women and feminism or something like that. If you had shown me his song without any context of what kinds of people were reacting to it, what the general reception was, who was listening to it, if you just showed me the song and you asked me, who's this going to resonate with more? People on the right or people on the left? My instant answer would be, oh yeah, people on the right. Obviously. And there were people who were saying, like, this isn't about right and left. This is a song of the working class. It's fair enough. But you have to understand how certain things are going to be interpreted. I noticed this when I provided my faux reaction to his video first time around. Because I used liberal reacts in the title, I think people went into the video already presuming certain things about me and my opinions. That video by far has the most views on this channel, but those people didn't watch my other content. So they didn't really have a general conception of who I am, what I speak about on the channel. They didn't realize that I'm not really some far left-wing person. My guess is people saw the title Liberal Reacts. They started hearing some of the things I was saying, which were admittedly more left-wing in that video, and then just assumed I was a complete far leftist and were projecting opinions onto me like nobody's business. But when it comes down to it, this is what partisanship breeds.
Got a way to for us as just us as a society, maybe find a way to leap out of that. Like what we're facing in today's world is much bigger than that. That is important. It's important that we have politics and that we have a system in which we decide how different ideas are implemented into government, but it can't rule us either. Like we've allowed it to not sit here at the wayside, but we've allowed it to almost encapsulate all of us. Like it's become sort of the ceiling under which we live under. And, you know, I've had people say that I'm a fence sitter and that I need to have some sort of call to action. And I guess like if there's anything that I would respond to that with, given the opportunity we have now, it's like, I think we need to take a step back and re-envision what we want the next 20 or 30 years to look like. And there's an important verse that came to mind. This is in Matthew 22, starts in 34, but it's where the Pharisees are questioning Jesus on, like, because even throughout the Bible, there are contradictions, obviously, and people have different forms of opinion and different ways things are worded even throughout the Bible. But he says, a Pharisee asked Jesus, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is love your neighbor as yourself." And like, as simple as that is, if we could just find a way to make those two commandments, even outside of religious boundaries, if we could learn to make that our priority and then base our differences below that, like God is here, our love for each other here, and then below that is try to find a way to integrate our differences in a way that everyone can live a better life. Like, it would resolve a lot of the conflicts that have become like way overcomplicated,
Now, the problem with this in some way is that the very notion of God and religion has become right-wing in this country. To speak of religion is to speak in favor of conserving religion. So if you're going to try to create a movement that transcends the boundaries between the right and the left, we can't fully rely on religion. People don't see the world through religious narratives in the way that they have in the past. I'm someone who's been on both sides of this. I was an atheist for the majority of my life, and I am no longer an atheist. Of course, being from both perspectives, it's given me a very different view of exactly what kind of thinking distinguishes someone who is religious from someone who's non-religious, and how that can manifest in alternative visions that are either liberal or conservative. The central ethic there is wonderful. Treat your neighbor as yourself. Unfortunately, there are certain people that won't be able to even get behind the utterance of something like that because it has a connotation that is connected with all of these other things that someone on the left or someone who's a-religious might not agree with. The general line of reasoning from atheistic types is that the Bible justifies all kinds of heinous acts, and that those who believe in the infallible word of God as represented in the Bible are merely cherry-picking to suit one's own personal convictions. Once again, you can agree with that claim or not. The whole point is, these kinds of objections stifle the conversation before it even gets started.
I don't think there is any difference between treating yourself properly and treating other people properly. And part of the reason for that is purely practical. It's like, think about it this way. You are very badly outnumbered. There's one of you and 8 billion other people. And so if you mistreat other people, if you put yourself first, that is going to come to haunt you, man, in a way you can't possibly imagine. Whereas if, by contrast, you treat other people as if they're as valuable as you in every interaction you have, people are going to be so thrilled to have you around that they're going to be extending you the same luxury constantly. And so perversely, by stopping focusing on your own narrow self-interests and by inviting other people into the game, everyone will have more and so will you. You know, you said earlier in our conversation that people have this difficulty when they have to sacrifice the present for the future, right? And the thing is when you start to think about the future, what you're doing is saying, well, the 50-year-old me, you know, the me that's 10 years down the road, is just as important as the me that's here right now. And so is the 60-year-old me. And so you have to construe yourself as a community that iterates across time. And then you have to take that whole community into account. And if you do that, it's the same as taking other people into account. And it's the proper moral orientation.
Man, treat yourself as a community that iterates across time. That is such a psychedelic idea. Holy smokes. Just saying.
And it's not proper for arbitrary reasons. It's proper because if everyone did that, the world would become peaceful and abundant, and we could live in something approximating harmony, and many of the problems that beset us would, merely as a consequence of the better governance that would emerge, many of the problems that would that are plaguing us would vanish. You know, we've been working on this enterprise in London called the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, trying to develop a vision for the future. Let me tell you one thing about it and ask you what you think about it. So we've been trying to figure out how you tell the real leaders, you know, let's say someone comes to you and says, I've got a vision for the future. And you might say, well, those are kind of a dime a dozen. How the hell do I know that you're not just another manipulator or, you know, in it for your own narrow purposes? How do I know I can trust you? And so I've been trying to work through that. So here's some possibilities. You tell me what you think about this. So I would say if the person who's developing the vision is trying to impose their vision on you by force, then they're not good leaders. Yeah. And if they're trying to terrify you into adopting their vision, so they use fear, then they're not good leaders. They're good leaders if they offer you a vision like you offered your wife, which is, here's a possible game. What do you think of it? And would you like to voluntarily play? If someone can do that, then they're a leader you can trust. At least, you know, assuming they're playing a straight game. And so the rule is, if the person is using power and compulsion or fear, then their vision is unreliable. And so I think that's even true if there is a crisis. You don't get to terrify people.
Couldn't agree more. When you believe that there is an imperative, that something must be done, it's a very simple step to justify all means to achieve whatever ends. And that's pretty much the basis for most atrocities throughout history, imposing their own vision on someone else. Because if we don't do it, all hell will break loose. Anyone who tries to stand in our way must be stopped. They must be coerced into following the vision. If you could envision a harmonious world, what it would actually look like is an entire collective submitting to some kind of higher ideal, not because they were forced to, but because they actually wanted to. If such a vision is crafted, and if such a voluntary submission is achieved, that's going to be good for everyone. Of course, contingent on the fact that the vision itself has good intentions for those who submit. Because you can think about a historical example like the Jim Jones cult.
We all wanted to go. I wanted to go. It looked like freedom.
The people who decided to join that church traveled to South America with Jim Jones and devote their lives to this cause, which ultimately gave Jim Jones himself a whole bunch of power, and he had access to sleeping with women. I mean, it was a completely corrupt enterprise. But something so odd about that example was it was purely voluntary brainwashing. I mean, people put their children to death and put themselves to death because they were completely enamored with one figure, and they voluntarily submitted to the vision of one figure. That's all to say this stuff is tricky to determine exactly what constitutes voluntary submission.
They have to invite them. So what do you think about that? What's your first response to that?
Yeah, I think that I'd say that it's obvious that at the core of anyone's motive is really it's either love or hate. It's either that it's something that's obviously benefiting people, that people are excited to promote themselves. But then there are a lot of things you see implemented that are they can be very well disguised, but at their core they are fear-based. You know, like either in a sense of intimidation or in a sense of maybe false sense of urgency. Like I've experienced that myself now, just with my career opportunities. Like, you've got to do this now, and it's perceived in a way that's supposed to be helping me, but it really is it's driven off the human emotion of fear. And so I think that's the way to ultimately understand if something is, like in your case, if something is genuine and authentic,
the
or
real
not,
thing
is what human emotion is it being driven off of? Is it being driven off of love and ambition, or is it being driven more off of hate and fear?
That can be true, but once again, I mean, something that starts off being based around love can often turn to something that is coercively upheld through fear. And so I think part of this initiative that's being outlined here for what constitutes good leadership is a message that's non-coercive promotes voluntary adoption, but that stays consistent in the allowance for that voluntary adoption, even as the vision itself and the dynamics of the vision itself transform. Because sometimes people are going to be comfortable within one state of your vision, but they're not going to be comfortable within future iterations, and they're going to want to drop out at that time. And this is how you have movements that start off a certain way and then they ultimately get corrupted over time. In many ways, that's what's happened to some degree in the United States. I mean, there's some people, radical, far left Reconstructionists, let's say, who believe the Constitution is an outdated document, that it needs to be updated, revised, that the people who wrote the founding documents initially were somehow morally bankrupt. More conservative types might point out that you can't remove someone's behavior from their temporal context. Those counterpoints often fall on deaf ears because the decision has been made by those who seek to reform the movement that the whole experiment itself was corrupt from the beginning. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why empires rise and fall, because those in the future begin to question the initial aims of the origin. Then again, people who believe the Constitution needs to be revised or reinterpreted with an additional layer besides the originalist interpretation hold the viewpoint that however people viewed the Constitution at a previous point did not have the context that we now have. They couldn't have foreseen these additional iterations of society that now alter the document in some way. Of course, the problem then is, how can you be so sure that your proposed iterations for the document won't pervert its essence to an extent that would cripple the underlying message on which the whole thing was based upon? And you could also point out a constitution, a Bill of Rights, isn't the fabric of an entire country, that a country is more significantly attached to its institutions. This is a point that Antonin Scalia made. I believe the point was Soviet Russia had a spectacular Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights of the former evil empire, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was much better than ours. They guaranteed freedom of the speech, of the press, of street demonstrations and protests, and anyone who is caught trying to suppress criticism of the government will be called to account. That Constitution of the Soviet Union did not prevent the centralization of power.
It's not about the rights that are endowed. It's about the systems that are in place to actually uphold the rights. It's easy enough to write things down and claim to be in support of that, right? It's easy enough to call yourself the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Having systems in place that uphold democratic republicanism is a very different matter.
But she doesn't know your name, but she would get driven crazy because anytime I'm in the house, like cooking dinner or doing anything, I've got Philosopher Man on. And so she'd say, "Oh, you're listening to Philosopher Man again." But I'd listen to your stuff for hours every night. And so it's just crazy that we're sitting here having this conversation. But I told her I was going on the Jordan Peterson podcast, and she said, "Jordan Peterson." I said, Philosopher Man.
So, you have to apologize to her for me. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, that's pretty. It's pretty funny, all right. Yeah. Well, that's. Yeah. Well, that's so interesting. Well, it's so interesting too for me to see that that you developed this crazy vision a few years ago, and now all these surreal things are happening to you. And I actually think that's how the world works, man. I think the world has a real dreamlike quality to it, which is why we dream to try to figure it out, and that your dreams call to you. I mean, that's what the psychoanalysts taught. I certainly learned that from Freud, and more even from Carl Jung, that your dreams, you can dream the future. In fact, that's how the future comes about. You either dream the future or you let it turn into a nightmare. Like, those are the options. And so you dream the future by asking yourself what you want, assuming that you're trying to take care of yourself. And you do that in a way that brings other people on board. With this ARC enterprise in the UK, we're trying to develop a vision that when people hear, they think, geez, I'd make some sacrifices to be part of that. I'd put some work into that. They're not trying to hit me over the head with a cudgel, and they're not trying to frighten me. They're trying to invite me to the table, right? They're inviting me to the discussion. And that's really what we're praying, and both metaphorically and literally to do, is to say, look, man, if we got our act together if we were all visionaries and we told the truth and we cooperated properly, we could make the desert bloom, right? There's no limit to the problems we could solve. We don't have to run around like Chicken Little claiming that the sky is falling and, put all these limitations on ourselves and doom the third world to penury and starvation and assume that there's too many people on the planet. We could just shoulder our damn burdens and walk uphill properly and fix the place. And we can do that. And if we don't, well, we'll get what's coming to us. And we've had that happen a couple of times in the 20th century, and that wasn't so pretty. And so hopefully we'll be smart enough. God, I hope we're smart enough not to do that again.
Yeah, I mean that there's verses in Ecclesiastes that talk about repetition throughout time, but there's always that same driving force and that element that created the Soviet Union and created so many nightmares before it and after it. Like that still is just as much present today as it was then. And it's like if we don't, it's like you have to be proactive at keeping that balance, that harmony there, because like the political climate in the world we live in now is benefiting a handful of people, and it seems like that handful of people is doing everything they can to keep the system in that sort of disorder. But if people could, and you're right, and it's like you talk about the power of imagination, but it really is the truth. It's like if people could just figure out in their own space how to make things better and just even have a vision of things being better, and just a certain amount of people did that, like that's all it takes. And then a lot of the problems that we talk about, like even in politics and all, would almost resolve themselves just inherently from that.
From people taking responsibility. Well, that's right. Well, there's another scene in Exodus where that's actually laid out. It becomes part of the principle of subsidiarity, which is a core element of Catholic social doctrine and a fundamental element of genuine conservatism, which is that if you build a hierarchy of responsibility, so individual, marital, familial, community, state, all of those levels, and every single level takes its responsibility, there's no reason to have a king, and there's no desert, right? And the rule is something like this, is every bit of responsibility that you refuse to take on your own behalf, on behalf of your family, let's say, or your community, that responsibility will be taken up by tyrants and used against you. And I think, well, how could it be any different, right? Because if you leave something necessary just lying there on the table, it's just an invitation for a thief to steal it, like obviously. So yeah, you make a vision for your own life and you take responsibility, because if you don't, someone else will steal. Someone else will steal your destiny. Someone else will steal your soul, and it might be a handful of people, or it might be the dread spirit that's driving their greed. And that's something whose hands you do not want to fall into. You'll end up on the road to hell, or contemplating or committing suicide or torturing people. And that's probably not the vision you want to pursue. That's for sure.
So, because it's very contagious.
All right, sir.
Yeah, it's very, that energy is very contagious. Yeah, like just think about just going back to our conversation about commuting on the interstate, but just somebody cuts somebody else off, and that it's almost like they hold on to that, and then whether they do it consciously or passive aggressively, at some point, maybe it's to their boss or their kids or their coworker, but then they kind of pass it off on somebody else, and it creates this. Everything's very much more. It's very connected in a way that we don't really see on the surface levels.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, I had a vision of that here recently. So people think, well, I'm just one person in a mass of 8 billion, what can I do? But imagine this, imagine a globe, okay, with points on it, and then all those points are networked together, Okay, so now imagine you're one of those points on that globe. Now, when you zoom into it from a distance, that point will be the one that's closest to you, so it looks like it's the top of a kind of like a rounded pyramid. That's a way of thinking about it. So you're at the center of a web of 1,000 people, because you're going to know 1,000 people well in your life, at least. You're going to have an influence on them. And then those 1,000 are surrounded by 1,000 each. And so that's 1,000,000 people, one person away from you. And it's 1,000,000,000 people, two people away from you. And that's where you are. You're in the center of the world in that way. You, 1,000 people, 1,000,000 people, and then 1,000,000,000 people. You're at that center. And everything you do echoes. And the world's set up like that. So we're each a center where everything we do echoes. And that's a terrifying thing to realize, right? Because that means whatever happens is on you. I was reading this Dostoevsky quote the other day and writing about it. He said he has a father there, Zosima, who is the spiritual guide of this, I think it's Alyosha, who's a monastic novitiate in the Brothers Karamazov, which is a great book. And Zosima tells Alyosha, you are responsible not only for everything you do, but for everything everyone else does. And you think, Jesus, that's a completely absurd proposition. But then you think, well, you think about it this way, man. If you were the worst person you could be, and that's something to think about. If you were the worst person you could be, you could produce a lot of hell and misery. God only knows how much. A lot of people would be way worse than they are because of you. And maybe, infinitely worse. But if you were the best person you could be, a lot of people who are bad wouldn't be nearly as bad as they are. And so when you see all this misery around you and all these miserable people, you got to ask yourself, how much of that is a consequence of the things that you've left undone? Mm-hmm. Or the things you've did. And man, if you have any sense and you really think about that, that'll terrify you right to the bottom of your soul. And that's a good thing. It's a terrible thing, but it's a necessary thing.
And that's why I just, the more I've thought through sort of even just what it is you said now, there has to be something pure and honest and righteous at the top of our focus collectively in order to maintain that. But that's, that's really that's the importance of idolizing God at the top of that structure. That's the only way I see that purity and that honesty being maintained collectively among a group of people. But that's a great way. That's a great analogy with the spider web. I like that.
Yeah. Well, it's a very good vision. Well, and I think what you closed with there is correct. As far as I can tell, that's the insistently repeated message of the biblical corpus and all the works of wisdom that surround it, is that you have to put what's appropriately ultimate at the top. And that is something like the sum of all that's good, right? The summum bonum. That's a definition of God. It's truth and beauty and justice and mercy all united into a single character. That's a way of thinking. A character you're supposed to embody and put at the top, which is the same as celebrate or worship. Yeah, I think that's right. Look, we should stop. I guess it's 107 minutes into this 90-minute podcast, and it was really fun talking to you.
That's good stuff. I know I didn't have a lot to say there in the last 15 minutes. Part of it is that I mainly agreed with everything being said. Also, I didn't want to get too hooky-kooky while Jordan was talking about how life can become a dream come true if you take the proper measures. I could have very easily gone off the rails there. I will save such metaphysical spiels for another point. And I hope everyone enjoyed this 3-part reaction for those of you who stuck around for all of them. Take care. See you next time.